Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Congratulations for being here on a thunderstorm. So, congratulations. Hello, everybody. My name is Heidi Holder, and I'm the Frederick P. and Sandra P. Rose Chair of Education, and I'd like to welcome you to the Metropolitan Museum of Art for what is going to be an amazing talk. Thank you for joining us today to explore the dynamic relationships between artist peers, pivotal artist peers, artist friendships, and I added this, love affairs, rivalries, beef, they call it now, significantly shape their creative decisions and the broader evolution of their perspectives. No artist exists in isolation, and today we have an opportunity to delve into how shared social and material environments influence these peers, shaping artworks that have come to define ideas about art and art making that we still hold now. Our program begins with Dita Amory, the Robert Lehman curator in charge, discussing Henri Matisse and Derain. Their 1905 summer together in the French Mediterranean marked a turning point in early modernist painting, exemplifying an aesthetic dialogue on the origins of Fauvism. Following this, we have co-curators Stephan Wolohojian and Ashley Dunn, who will explore the complex relationship between Édouard Manet and Edgar Degas, highlighting both shared artistic objectives and conflicting approaches. This is where the beef comes in today. Lastly, we have Kathryn Galitz, an artist and art historian, Joachim Pissarro, who is appearing virtually due to illness, will broaden the discussion, touching on the significance of artist relationships and reflecting on additional pairings like Cézanne and Pissarro, Matisse and Picasso. Before handing it over to the speakers, I must extend our gratitude to the sponsors whose support has made this program possible, as well as the exhibitions Manet, Degas, and the Vertigo of Color. So we extend our thanks to Alice Carey Brown and W.L. Leon Brown, the Sherman Fairchild Foundation, and the Harry and Linda Fath for their leading support, as well as the Janice H. Levin Fund, the Gail and Parker Gilbert Fund, the Sam and Janet Saltz Trust, and Rosalind and Kenneth Landis for their additional gifts. And for Vertigo of Color, we would like to thank the Florence Gould Foundation with additional support to an anonymous foundation. Now we've got that very important part out of the way, I'd like to welcome Dita Amory to the stage to start the proceedings. Thank you. Please warm her up.
Thank you very much, Heidi. It's a pleasure to share the stage with Stephan and Ashley, and we're very grateful to Joachim and Kathy for exploring history-making artist partnerships in the later decades of the 19th century and early years of the 20th. But first, we need our slides. There we go. This is a rare moment to evaluate several of those relationships, and indeed, the Manet-Degas dialogue elucidates as much about the changing language of art in their day as does the exchange between Matisse and Derain in the early years of modernism. Thank you all for joining us. It was on June 25th, 1905, that Matisse wrote a postcard to his young friend, André Derain, urging the artist to join him in Calley. I cannot insist too strongly that a stay here is absolutely necessary for your work. You would find yourself in the best possible conditions, and you would reap pecuniary advantages from the work you could do here. I am certain that if you take my advice, you will be glad of it. This is why I say to you, come. Ever the gentleman, writing with self-deprecating modesty, Matisse sidestepped the argument that spending several weeks in his company would train the eye and hand of the younger artist in ways no one could ever predict. Indeed, the aesthetic experiments of that summer and the daily dialogues that fueled their ambition laid early groundwork for modernism as we know it today. Matisse and Derain could not have imagined the profoundly consequential impact of their Calley experiments. They were on a course to subvert descriptive color, exploring a palette of hues responsive to their own sensations. Matisse was lured to the south of France the previous summer when Paul Signac invited him and his wife Amélie to Saint-Tropez. Signac, a great mariner, actually painted in Couleur in 1887 when the insular village was only accessible to boat traffic. Matisse was immediately captivated by the Mediterranean, above all by the extraordinary light, so intoxicated by the shifting light of day as it ricocheted off the water and cast long shadows of color inland. He determined to return, and that he did the following summer. In fact, Matisse was so attached to the memory of Couleur that he returned repeatedly for many years, and not always in the summer. In May 1905, Matisse settled into a modest hotel near the railroad station with his wife and 2 young sons. Derain joined him in early July. Derain's arrival was a bit of a spectacle. Tall and lanky, it said that he arrived in a dashing white suit, sporting a red peaked cap, and balancing a handcart filled to overflowing with trunks, suitcases, and a parasol bigger than a custom official's umbrella. He may have overpacked, but you can be sure that art supplies were nowhere to be found in a modest coastal village where residents spoke only Catalan and lived off the meager rewards of sardine and anchovy fishing. The sight of 2 French artists wandering around in search of imagery to paint or draw must have caused quite a stir. Matisse and Derain were in passionate dialogue all summer, debating their color sensations and the challenge of translating shadowless light. And yet, from the start, they had markedly different goals. Derain preferred to paint rather than draw. A man of impetuous temperament, he found his subjects on one of the many coves that defined the village coastline. The most famous of these, the Plage Voromar, was bounded by Notre-Dame des Anges and its towering bell tower on one side and an old fort on the other. Derain's paintings capture the hustle and bustle of a seaside port, hauling boats ashore, sorting fishing nets. He was often in a hurry to bring closure to his canvases, finishing off as many paintings as he could. In the fleeting days of summer, he returned to Paris with 30 finished canvases. Derain was only 24 years old when he made his way to Couleur. He'd barely launched his career as an artist. Sharing a studio with the brash and talented Vlaminck in Chatou, a village along the Seine, 18 kilometers from Paris, Derain had hardly put brush to canvas when conscripted into military service in 1901. Matisse was not much better off. He was known in Paris and earning solid respect among fellow artists, but his pictures had not fared well in his first commercial gallery exhibition at Derain-Rouelle in 1904. The market had yet to discover his developing genius. By 1905, Matisse had a wife and 3 children to support. He candidly shared his financial worries in letters to friends and at times borrowed small sums from the more affluent among them just to get by. Unlike the impatient Derain, Matisse had no plan to finish off several dozen paintings in Couleur. With few exceptions, he preferred to use watercolor or pen and ink to sketch his subjects, often very rapidly. Matisse wrote to his friend Signac that he was building a stock of material, sketches and watercolors, to use later in his Paris studio. He returned to Paris in September with 15 oil sketches, 40 watercolors, and more than 100 drawings in pen and ink. It was from his second-floor studio, overlooking the cove known as the Porte de Val, that Matisse sketched his numerous pen and ink drawings. Vibrant and fresh, his graphic observations were so accurate that a fisherman could tell the time of day, sometimes even the precise hour at which the drawings were made. Matisse's watercolors, spare in medium and fluid in strokes, are works of an assured colorist, searching to find an image. His colors are rarely blended. His palette transitions from cool blues and greens to warm pinks, reds, and yellows. In most of these watercolors, the white of the paper support emits light in the interstices between colors. Of course, watercolors were portable, as were their tools. The paints would have traveled easily from the studio to the port and beyond to the foothills of the Pyrenees. Much as the reserve of paper activated light in the drawings, so too did the canvas ground serve the same role in the paintings of both artists. It was common practice among artists to prime their raw canvases with a ground or priming layer, sealing the open canvas weave before applying the paint layer. The shade of the priming naturally influenced the paint layers, modulating color and the overall tonality of the composition. A darker ground would tend to visually absorb colors, while a stark white primer achieved the reverse. It functioned as a light source, enabling the picture to give off its own light. A deep gray ground was used in the painting Couleur to give weight and density to the clustering of houses, cobalt blue sea, and coastline beyond. In the near right corner, Derain retains the primer as a zone of color, dotting the dark landscape with a few red flowers. In sailboats at Couleur, the sharp white priming ground actually defines the cascading sails, over which Derain has lightly added pigment. The white primer adds a warm luminescence to the whole image, otherwise dotted with color to differentiate form and volume. This highly successful painting must have been an eyesore in 1905, a daring vision, barely painted, sparkling with light and thoroughly energized despite its economies. The dots and dashes may recall the pointillist technique of Neo-Impressionism, but Derain is clearly on a new path. Of the many formal discoveries drawn from painting and raking sunlight, one threads through Derain's port paintings, the transforming palette of shadows. In one of his many letters to Vlaminck, Derain wrote, "Why, it's the light, a blonde light, golden, which suppresses the shadows. It's maddening work." What he was saying is that the shadows were full of light and therefore full of color. In fishing boats Couleur, opaque blue shadows crawl over the diagonal white sails. In the faubourg of Couleur, olive green shadows weave around the sand and the near ground. In the port of Couleur, the beached vessels cast cobalt blue shadows. These colorful paintings may give you the impression that Matisse and Derain were at ease in their new environment, dashing off paintings and watercolors at lightning speed. In fact, they were in agony most of the summer, for they were on a wholly new aesthetic ground, testing norms, repudiating conventions, two young artists unsure of the outcome of their audacious experiments. Matisse said it plainly years later, "We were at that time like children in the face of nature, and we let our temperaments speak, even to the point of painting from the imagination when nature herself could not be used." Not only was color redefined in Couleur, so too was brushwork. Matisse and Derain had toyed with the divisionist marks of Neo-Impressionism, a style of painting dependent on the precise interaction of hues as laid out in scientific treatises. It was a practice among artists in Paris in the late 19th century, and many artists felt compelled to reckon with the rigors of this new technique. There was no more persuasive proselytizer than Paul Signac. Signac passionately urged fellow artists to embrace color theory, as advanced in the writings of the French theorists Charles Blanc and Michel Chevreuil, exhorting his contemporaries to read their treatises as a primer to study the admixture of pigments on canvas. If Neo-Impressionism was destined to produce a pulsating light through a scientific system of color interaction, the experiments of Couleur were on a far more visceral path. Matisse and Derain acknowledged their wish to master color translations of their sensations, and yet for both artists, the process was a struggle. Derain wrote to Vlaminck, "This color has messed me up. I've let myself go with color for color's sake. I've lost all my old qualities." Despite his growing reputation and stature in Paris, Matisse was no more self-assured. All his life, he doubted his convictions and struggled with emotional shifts. How could it have been otherwise in Couleur? The moment was exhilarating, but the stakes were high. No artist had ever leaned into a palette of colors, ignoring nature's empirical evidence. It took audacity, strong will, and a chemistry in partnership to sustain the adventure. One of the great privileges of working as a curator at the Met is the chance to collaborate with conservators. Isabelle Duvernois in our Department of Painting Conservation undertook an extensive technical analysis of our Lehman collection painting, Olive Trees at Couleur, preliminary to its inclusion in the exhibition. Her findings were revelatory for us. Once unframed, she discovered pinholes at all four corners of the canvas. This evidence suggests that Matisse may have painted the landscape outdoors and then used pushpins as spacers to protect and isolate the wet canvas when walking home at the end of a painting session. I mentioned earlier that Matisse was content to make sketches or pochades. Sorry, my slides seem to have. Oh, anyway, I mentioned earlier that Matisse was content to make sketches in couleur called pochades, but there are a few examples of fully realized canvases. The open window is not only one of the great pictures to emerge from couleur, it's one of the singular triumphs of the Fauve period. Matisse has run wild with color and brushwork. Looking at the painting in formal terms, Matisse introduces a range of brushwork, a riot of fauve color, and a spatial structure of dense complexity. He painted his small canvas in his makeshift studio overlooking the Porte d'Aval. The artist is looking out the window, its French doors framing the near and distant view. In this picture, measuring only 21 by 18 inches, Matisse has spatially crafted 3 zones, the interior with its flat, thinly brushed color in rhyming hues of viridian green and fuchsia pink, the near-ground outdoors where pots of geraniums decorate the ledge and ivy covers the balustrade and surrounding frame, all painted in pulsating marks, quick daubs of color, and finally in the distance, linear strokes lay in the suggestion of anchored vessels bobbing on the water in the harbor. The painting dazzles the eye as if illuminated by a single field of light. Colors dance off each other in a complex choreography of tints. There was another player central to the painterly investigations that summer in couleur, and that was Amélie Matisse. She'd fallen in love with Henri Matisse several years earlier and determined to devote her life to him and his advancing career. He famously told her before they married, "Mademoiselle, I love you dearly, but I shall always love painting more." Amélie was selfless to the end, or I should say, until she could no longer tolerate life with her husband. She produced 2 sons, Jean and Pierre, adopted Marguerite, Matisse's love child from an earlier liaison, and offered a steadying hand time and again when her husband looked to her to calm his nerves. Matisse suffered acute tension at his easel right through his life, and couleur was no exception. Amélie found ways to ease his anxiety. She took him on long walks and read to him in the night when insomniac demons haunted his sleep. Much later in life, after decades of sacrifice in the service of her husband's career, Amélie could no longer bear her peripheral role. A beguiling Russian model had taken center stage. Finding models in a simple fishing village in 1905, where no one spoke French and few would have understood the needs of 2 young artists, was next to impossible. Amélie stepped in. She sat for her husband and for Derain, modeling in every setting, from the beach at La Moulade to the cork oak woodland above the village, to the studio above the Porte d'Aval. We have examples of Amélie modeling in paintings, watercolors, and drawings. A Met drawing by Derain is a marvelous affirmation of the intimacy of that summer. Matisse sketches his wife at water's edge, while Derain records it all in ink. In La Japonaise, Woman Beside the Water, Matisse makes a dazzling statement of color and brushwork. Painted outdoors, Amélie is barely recognizable in a kaleidoscope of colors freely brushed. Only the curls and squiggles of her robe give outline to her abstracted profile pose. Spatially and chromatically organized on the white ground layer of the board, the marks activate the picture plane with a unique visual rhythm. This is another example where pinholes at each corner of the support suggest that Amélie was posing outdoors. The Met's pen and ink drawing sketched on site is further proof that Amélie sat for La Japonaise at water's edge. One of the finest paintings to emerge from the summer in couleur is a portrait of Amélie Matisse by Derain. Matisse and Derain generally spent their days combing the beaches and inland foothills, searching for imagery, but when the midday sun heated couleur to an intolerable temperature, they retreated to the studio to paint. We imagine that Amélie posed for Woman with a Shawl, Madame Matisse in a kimono, in the couleur studio. Despite the title, do we call it a portrait? I would instead call it a figure painting with a known model. Derain focuses less on physiognomy, less on the individual than on color and patterning. The red and green polarities that we've come to recognize in other paintings animate the canvas in relational color and variegated brushwork. Amory as subject is entirely defined by her voluminous kimono, its broadly stroked folds of fabric and choreography of cobalt blue patterning. The model demurs in her expression, as if to signal that she's just a prop, enabling Derain to paint magnificent color and audacious patterning, a painting ostensibly finished, and yet fundamentally an investigation in color and brushwork. I mentioned earlier that Matisse and Derain retreated to the studio on the hottest of days, and it was there that they painted portraits, and in the case of Matisse, still life subjects. Two of the most powerful portraits to emerge from that summer are their reciprocal likenesses. Derain paints Matisse in thick, deliberate strokes, solid and serious. He controls the distribution of light and shadow, the latter so demonstrative in the viridian green modeling of the cheek and forehead. The brushwork in Matisse's portrait of Derain is much more free-form, sketchier. One has the impression that Matisse dashed it off, testing his own green facial shadow in a quick mix of strokes, strokes testing color more than modeling. Emblematically, the portraits remind us of the deep and nourishing friendship that emerged that summer. Two artists meeting quite spontaneously in a quiet village in the south of France, uncertain of their future and unaware of the impact of their experiments on contemporary artists and beyond, on the erupting changes in the language of art. I've often been asked whether Matisse and Derain would have painted these subversive pictures had the two artists not been together in mutually reinforcing circumstances. Of course, we'll never know. It's easier to summarize the contributing factors that did align that summer. Matisse and Derain were young. They were together in welcome isolation, removed from the critical eye of Parisian circles. Matisse was grappling with the rigors of Neo-Impressionism, but he was frustrated and ready for change. He saw Neo-Impressionism as a straitjacket. Perhaps more than anything else, the ambition to capture Mediterranean sun on canvas called for an intensity of color commensurate with the intensity of light. So the timing was right, the partnership was right, and the hot sun bearing down on these artists at their easels was right. As Derain stated it years later, colors became sticks of dynamite. They were primed to discharge light. Returning to Paris in September 1905, Matisse and Derain submitted several of their couleur paintings to the annual unjuried Salon d'Automne. Matisse actually intended to unveil his painting Porte d'Aval, a sweeping panorama of couleur in pointillist style, but when it wasn't finished in time, he dashed off a portrait of Amory that ignited a furor at the Salon. Woman with a Hat was antithetical to portraiture as the French public knew it. In many respects, this radical painting materializes the daring experiments of couleur and the transgressions to come in modernism's female portraiture. One need only look at Picasso's Women to confirm that eventuality. Matisse flouts every convention, every reasonable expectation. Color and brushwork take over the canvas. Colors buzz around Amelie's torso, offering no real understanding of modeling. Brushwork is riotous and raw. When Matisse was asked what color Amory was wearing when he painted her, he said black. Reflecting on his daring submissions to the Salon d'Automne, Matisse later told Signac, rather touchingly, "It was the first time in my life that I was content to be exhibiting, for my things are perhaps not very important, but they have the merit of expressing in a very pure way my sensations, something I've been working toward since I began to paint." It was at the Salon d'Automne of 1905 that the word fauve was coined. The submissions of Matisse and Derain were displayed in a gallery alongside several other French artists whose paintings of the south of France shared a radiant palette of sun-soaked colors. Centered in the gallery were two sculptures by a minor contemporary French sculptor, Albert Marc. In a detailed appraisal of the gallery's participants, the now legendary critic Louis Vaucel wrote with open-minded candor, "We possess today a luxuriant generation of young painters, daring to the point of excess, honest draftsmen, powerful colorists, from whom will arise the masters of tomorrow." Elsewhere in the article, Vaucel used the word fauve, literally wild beasts, to describe those powerful colorists. The Salon No. 7 became known as La Cage des Fauves. Vaucel further referenced the sculptor in the company of these renegade painters as Donatello among the wild beasts. The now famous article was not altogether damning. In fact, Vaucel recognized Matisse as robustly gifted. His assessment of Derain, however, was not so generous. Monsieur Derain is going to alarm people. I think he's more a poster designer than an artist. The decided character of his virulent imagery, the facile juxtapositions of his complementaries will seem willfully puerile to some. Let us recognize, nevertheless, that his boats, the drawing of sails, would happily decorate the walls of a child's room. This frank critique notwithstanding, Vaucel was actually far more generous in his overall appraisal than other journalists who took a much more conservative view. They accused the Fauve artists of taking color to a level of debauchery. They were accused of having no skill. Some were so angered that they admitted to having no words to critique these wild beasts. French art was on the brink of cataclysmic change. Picasso was finishing off Les Demoiselles d'Avignon in his Bateau Lavoir studio. Cubism was just years away, and Matisse himself was at the precipice of an extraordinary career in painting. Derain shifted to conservatism in later painting, but the artists who followed in the narratives of modernism owed a debt to the Couleur experiments and to the two protagonists who had the courage to paint explosively and own up to their daring adventure. Thank you. Thank you. Now I'd like to welcome Stephan and Ashley.
Thank you, Dita. Ashley and I are pleased to explore this topic further with you this afternoon and to expand this dialogue between artists further. We're going to turn to Manet and Degas and our exhibition that explores the complex relationship between these groundbreaking artists of the 19th century. Édouard Manet and Edgar Degas were friends, rivals, and at times antagonists who worked in conversation throughout their careers. Where's the beef? This is the first exhibition to examine their artistic dialogue through the direct juxtaposition of their paintings, drawings, and prints. It highlights the intersections of their artistic production, but also reveals the contrasts, conflicts, and divergent paths that shaped modernism from its origins. Manet and Degas were born just 2 years apart, both the eldest sons of Parisian upper-middle-class families, yet their differing temperaments led to strikingly distinct styles, political views, career strategies, and approaches to different media. Although they rarely worked side by side, each took stock of the other's work, distilling it until it became foundational for its own project, or never integrating it all, which is perhaps just as interesting to us in light of this afternoon's discussion. Given the scarce primary evidence of their interactions, hardly any correspondence between them remains. Direct comparison of their work is even more crucial, allowing us to assess how these giants of French painting define themselves with and against each other.
We begin the exhibition with two self-portraits, which right away introduce many contrasts between the artists. On the left is one of only two known self-portraits by Manet, which he produced late in his career. He presents himself both as a painter, holding the tools of his trade, and as a Parisian dandy in his black felt hat and yellow jacket. The rapidly sketched, seemingly unfinished hand echoes the quick action of the artist at work. On the right is Degas' largest and most ambitious self-portrait. Degas painted nearly 20 self-portraits in his youth and later returned to the subject in photographs. Here he pictures himself as a smartly dressed young bourgeois draftsman with a portfolio to his side and a drawing implement in his hand. As you come around the title wall, we immediately introduce some of the complexities and enigmatic qualities of their relationship, one of which is a conspicuous asymmetry. While no clearly identifiable representations of Degas by Manet are known to exist, a group of striking portraits, drawings, etchings, and a painting offers a glimpse of Degas' regard for his close colleague. Around 1868, when it seems the two were closest, Degas made 10 drawings of Manet, 5 of which are in the exhibition, along with 3 etchings. They show Manet in a variety of attitudes, but in each case at ease, revealing a sense of familiarity between the two men. Executed over the course of multiple sittings, they show the time spent in one another's company and a desire on the part of Degas to record this relationship. In making prints, he demonstrated an impulse to circulate his image of Manet among a small public.
Across the gallery hangs Degas' only painted portrait of Manet, here in the company of his wife. In 1863, a year after his father died, Manet married his longtime love interest, Suzanne Lehnoff, a pianist of considerable talent. A bachelor, Degas enjoyed the young couple's company and captured the casual intimacy of their evenings together in this double portrait of Manet listening to his wife at the piano. He presented the painting to the Manets as a gift, but for reasons still unknown, Manet slashed the right side of the canvas, slicing off his wife's profile. Understandably angry, Degas reclaimed his gift and returned a small still life Manet had given him. Manet's wife, Suzanne, had been his family's piano teacher. He portrayed her many times, but this particular painting seems to have been made in response to Degas' canvas that the artist defaced. The two compositions are set in the same room in the Manet apartment on the Rue de Saint-Pétersbourg, where the couple regularly received their friends on Thursdays. Although the painting now has a canvas strip added at its right side, decades after the painting was slashed, the cropped composition could still be seen conspicuously hanging in Degas' private apartment, as shown in this photograph. Some have speculated that in his 70s, Degas decided to repair the ruptured work, but it is just as likely that he purposely left the violated canvas as it was. The artist, known for his biting humor and sharp wit, hung it next to Manet's painting of a sliced ham with a glistening knife at its edge.
The second gallery takes you back to their origin story, in particular, this case at the center, over which you can glimpse a view further into the exhibition. Manet and Degas reportedly met in the Louvre in front of this painting, attributed at the time to the 17th century Spanish painter Diego Velázquez. Degas recalled that he was working on a copper plate for an etched copy of this painting, the resulting print you see here on the right, when Manet stopped to comment, "How audacious of you to etch this way without any preliminary drawing. I would not dare do the same." This exchange marked the beginning of an enduring friendship and an early hint of their rivalry. Indeed, Manet made his own copy after the same work. Precisely when he etched his version relative to meeting Degas is unknown, but he took a strikingly different approach, working in his studio using an intermediary drawing. Manet reversed the composition on his plate so that his etching printed in the same orientation as the original painting. These works are presented in the context of the two artists' early education. Both Manet and Degas circumvented the established training ground of the École des Beaux-Arts to learn their craft, perhaps signaling from the outset their shared desire for independence. An essential component of their formation was copying works of great European artists of the past, which they did partly through travel. But just as important were the collections of the Louvre, where they could copy works by Mantegna and Titian, for example. These and other models shaped the development of their own visual languages.
Born in Paris only 2 years apart, Manet and Degas were the eldest sons of wealthy bourgeois families. Manet's father was a senior civil servant, and his mother, a diplomat's daughter, was goddaughter of the King of Sweden. Degas belonged to a family of bankers and businessmen based in Paris, Naples, and New Orleans. After attending prestigious schools, both abandoned the studies in law expected of men of their class and instead followed paths that their fathers initially opposed. Each artist turned to portraiture as he launched his career and found willing subjects among family members. One of Manet's most frequent sitters, besides his wife Suzanne, was her son Léon, whose paternity is unclear, but whom the painter treated with fatherly affection. In 1867, Léon was given a job at Degas' family's business as well. Manet's work was accepted at the Salon for the first time in 1861. The reception of these paintings reassured his parents of his ability to embark on an artistic career. His father's health was failing at the time of this work when it was completed, and he died just 2 years later. Manet remained especially close with his mother, who lived with him and his wife and continued to hold a very well-attended social salon that Degas certainly frequented. Degas excelled at portraiture, adding complexity to portrait types and investing his sitters with incredibly charged psychological depth. It's difficult to trace the history of this painting, an exceptionally large portrait of Degas' beloved relatives in Florence with whom he lived while studying the treasures of the Renaissance past in that city. Among his largest canvases, it was a sensation when it was rediscovered at his 1918 studio sale after his death. Degas may have worked on it while he was in Florence in the 1850s, or he may have painted it from numerous studies after he had returned to Paris. We have some of these extraordinary studies hanging next to the audacious portrait, which shows the artist's austere aunt spoiler alert, by her daughters and standing apart from her husband, who sits with his back to the viewer. These closely observed drawings, capturing both his cousin and aunt's features as well as their bearing, barely prepare us for the impact of the extraordinary canvas, which cleaned for the exhibition as a revelation, even to those long familiar with it.
We arrive at Olympia in a gallery that presents the central importance of the Salon, the official juried exhibition of paintings, sculptures, and works on paper held by the Académie des Beaux-Arts annually after 1863. The Salon was an essential proving ground and public stage for artists. It was the main forum for attracting the attention of critics and collectors and facilitated government patronage through purchases and awards. Manet found early success there. Oh, did I miss one? There we go. Manet found early success there. This is the view looking backward from the wall where Olympia hangs. Part of his first submission, the Spanish singer seen on the right, earned him an honorable mention. Degas, meanwhile, spent years trying to produce an ambitious history painting worthy of the venue. He debuted in 1865 with Scene of War in the Middle Ages, which you see on the left. It's a strange and puzzling painting that went essentially unnoticed. That very same year, Manet's Olympia generated outrage among critics and the public for its frank representation of a contemporary courtesan, painted on a grand scale and in a manner that some perceived as flat, coarse, and dirty. Olympia subverted traditional academic approaches to the nude, including conventions of idealized beauty and guises of mythology. She gazes at the viewer with unabashed directness, while her maid brings flowers, perhaps from a client. Manet cast his frequent model, Victorine Meurent, as Olympia, and Laure, whose last name we do not know, as the maid. Laure's presence in the work alludes to the burgeoning free black community in Paris at this time, another sign of the painting's contemporaneity. Following the Salon of 1865, Degas abandoned history painting. This work from later that same year shows him moving in a new direction. The remarkable composition destabilizes traditional categories of painting. Is it a grand still life of flowers or a portrait? It is somehow both and neither.
Portraiture was in vogue in France during the mid-19th century and occupied an important place in the work of both artists. Neither relied on commissions, freeing them to focus primarily on family, friends, and public figures connected to their social and artistic circles. Both artists stretched the definition of portraiture, introducing ambiguities and exploring its narrative possibilities by representing a broad range of people, from members of high society to stage performers and women of the demi-monde. One of the great juxtapositions in the exhibition is the pairing of Degas' portrait of the artist James Tissot and Manet's portrait of the writer and critic Émile Zola. Degas portrays his friend, the fashionable painter Tissot, in a studio surrounded by canvases that reflect the wide-ranging tastes he shared with Degas. The composition is similar to that of Manet's Émile Zola, painted around the same time, but whereas Zola's posture is rigid, Tissot leans nonchalantly across a startling familiarity with the beholder. Manet painted his portrait of Zola in recognition of his recent support for his work in the press. He too surrounded him with attributes of his occupation, including his recently published article praising Manet, which appears as a blue pamphlet propped on his desk. The framed collage of prints on the wall echoes a device that Degas used in his collector of prints 2 years prior. But here, Manet included a photograph of his own Olympia, a, quote, masterpiece worthy of the Louvre, according to Zola, as well as a Japanese woodcut and a print after Velázquez, both of which point to his artistic influences. Manet's balcony, comes at the end of this gallery. It includes his first portrait of the painter Berthe Morisot, who is shown seated along with the landscape artist Antoine Guimet and the violinist Fanny Klaus. The figures appear frozen and detached, trapped behind the balcony railing in the liminal space between the public street and the private interior of the dark room beyond. Manet was introduced to the sister painters Berthe and Edmond Morisot at the Louvre through their mutual friendship with artist Henri Fontaine-Latour. The Manet and Morisot families soon became close and invited each other to their weekly salons, which Degas also attended. Morisot looks nothing less than resplendent in Manet's second major painting of her. Here in her studio, she takes a decidedly more relaxed pose. Manet was captivated by her and made many likenesses of her until she married his younger brother in 1874. After that happened, he never painted her portrait again. Morisot would later support Degas' efforts to collect Manet's work.
A gallery devoted to the racetrack explores one of the artist's social milieu as well as a shared subject of contemporary life. Horse racing became an increasingly popular pastime for Parisians in this period, with the inauguration of new racetracks at Longchamp and Vincennes on the outskirts of the city. The high-stakes, thrilling competition, arresting speed, and diverse crowds of the racecourse appealed to the artists who sought to depict scenes of contemporary life. Degas was quick to recognize its modernity, creating his first racing pictures in the early 1860s. They both treated the subject repeatedly in a pictorial dialogue that continued into the 1870s and beyond. In this pair, both artists present long views down the track with the stands bordering the left sides of the compositions. They each choose distinct moments in the sport. Degas on the left favors the seconds before the start, the subtle and suspenseful choreography of the mounts chomping at the bit with a horse startling in the distance. Manet's scene, on the other hand, is all gallop, visual explosion, and acceleration with the throng of horses and jockeys thundering straight toward the viewer. A drawing by Degas reveals that the two artists spend time at the racecourse together. The loosely sketched woman with field glasses in the upper left of the sheet appears as well in a painted study that hangs next to it. The pair suggests that Degas may have intended to work up a larger composition that integrated the field spectator and his artist friend.
Manet regularly produced works based on events that touched or outraged him as a citizen, whereas Degas shied away from current events in his public work. Early in the artist's relationship, the United States was torn apart by civil war. This dramatic painting captures an important naval battle of that war fought off the coast of France in June of 1864. Manet's sympathy for the Union and his young interest in joining the Navy may have prompted him to paint this canvas, his first known seascape and first painting of a current event. It shows the sinking of the Confederate boat, the CSS Alabama, after it was hit by the Union's USS Kearsarge. The U.S. Civil War directly affected Degas' family. His mother was from New Orleans, and he had relatives who supported the Confederacy and continued to make their living from the cotton trade. In the autumn of 1872, Degas made his first visit to these shores. Going double for some reason. His first famous work from his stay in New Orleans depicts the lively office of his family's cotton business. Degas' maternal uncle, pictured in the foreground, assesses the quality of the valuable commodity, while his brother, René, reads the daily local Times-Picayune, and his other brother, Achille, leans casually against the counter at left, looking on as employees busy themselves with activity.
Here we investigate the two artists' relationships with Impressionism, specifically its association with painting en plein air or outdoors. Beginning in 1874, Degas played a leading role in organizing the independent, non-juried shows that later became known as the Impressionist exhibitions. Although popularly considered a leader of the movement, Manet refused to exhibit among their ranks. But he did go further than Degas in adopting scenes of outdoor leisure as his subject matter, as attested by the works on this wall, all by Manet. In the 1870s, Manet and Degas gathered regularly at Paris cafes for lively discussion and debate with fellow artists, poets, novelists, and journalists. The portraits that the two artists produced during this period depict many of the same café habitués, such as the painter-printmaker Marcellin Debutin, shown on this wall at full length by Manet, and seated on the far right by Degas. This gallery emphasizes especially the close relationships each artist developed with writers, who were their crucial champions. Against a striking teal sofa, Degas portrayed his friend and supporter Diego Martelli, an important Italian art critic and patron, in 1879. At the far left is Manet's 1880 portrait of his childhood friend Antonin Proust. As Minister of Fine Arts, Proust awarded Manet the Legion of Honor and later wrote an important biography of the artist.
In the second half of the 19th century, the cafes, shops, music halls, theaters, and ballet of Paris attracted artists and writers as spaces where diverse crowds intermingled. Drawing on the spectacle of these popular venues, Manet and Degas depicted working women and individual performers, casting different social types expressed through dress and deportment in their scenes. They took equal interest in stars and their audiences, shopkeepers, and clients. The two paintings on the screen are the poster images of the exhibition. Both artists painted the same model, the actress Hélène André, but arrive at very different paintings. Degas drew inspiration for the setting from the Café de la Nouvelle Athènes, where he often met Manet and other artists in their circle, including Marcellin Debutin, seen here at her right. His framing of the composition places the viewer at a nearby table looking toward the pair of drinkers whose indifference to one another and their surroundings imparts a sense of modern urban alienation. A year later, Manet evoked the same setting of the Nouvelle Athènes and selected the same model for his own café scene. Resting her head in hand, she ignores her brandy-soaked plum and unlit cigarette and gazes wistfully into the distance, conveying a sense of urban isolation similar to that evoked in Degas' painting. Manet centers his gaze on the woman alone with her drink, which in popular imagery of the time often implied moral indecency. She somehow seems available to her, although her identity is ambiguous.
From the public spaces of Paris, we move in the second-to-last gallery to more private interiors. We look here at how Manet and Degas reinvented the subject of the female nude for their own time. It's a moment to think back to Olympia and to consider how the artists rendered bodies with unprecedented frankness while candidly presenting the sexual commodification of female nudity in their day. At the same time, this gallery explores the differing gender dynamics conveyed in their work, primarily through the juxtaposition of Manet's Nana, who expresses a certain self-possession through pose and gaze, in comparison with Degas' earlier interior, fraught with tension and ambiguity. At left, Manet's Nana is based on a character from a novel by Zola, a high-class courtesan, Nana addresses the viewer with a knowing smile while applying her makeup. She is the protagonist, anchored at the center of the picture, while her patron, cast as a supporting character, looks on from the margin. At right is an earlier work by Degas that he referred to as my genre painting, which also has literary associations, having been connected with novels by Zola and Edmond Duranty. A menacing man leans against the door while a young woman in disheveled undergarments turns her back to him. The clothes thrown on the bed and corset lying on the floor extend the disturbing dimensions of the painting.
Shaken by Manet's premature death in 1883, Degas reportedly declared at the time of his friend's funeral that he, Manet, was greater than we thought. Degas took an active part in various commemorations, including a memorial banquet in 1885 and the subscription launched by Claude Monet in 1890 to acquire Manet's Olympia for the French state. Degas' lasting admiration for Manet is most evident in his personal art collection. By 1897, Degas had acquired 8 paintings, over a dozen drawings, and an almost complete set of prints by Manet. His commitment to the work of his fellow artists led him to reunite several of the dispersed fragments of one of Manet's most ambitious paintings, The Execution of Maximilian. After Manet's death, this painting was sold off in pieces. Degas painstakingly acquired all the fragments he could track down and mounted them on an enormous canvas that hung at the center of a museum-like gallery on the first floor of his apartment. In light of the tale of Degas' slashed double portrait, which we present at the start of our exhibition, it is difficult not to find resonance in the last gallery, where we see and are reminded by that painting through the slashed painting of Maximilian that was found in fragments after the artist's death. Degas' quest to bring together several of the fragments, the severed fragments, all he could find, and reunite them in the monumental canvas is a strong reminder of his commitment to the friendship between these two artists.
Thank you. We're very pleased to invite Kathy Galitz to the stage, who will join a conversation with Joachim Pissarro, who is joining us via Zoom.
Thank you, and now on to the afternoon's perhaps most unexpected pairing, but it is 2023 after all, so we're just going with it. I'm going to wait for Joachim to appear on the screen. Good afternoon, Joachim.
Good afternoon, Kathy. Good afternoon.
You have an auditorium full of people who are very excited to partake of this ongoing dialogue. And just before we begin our conversation, on behalf of Joachim, I want to thank Dita, Stephan, and Ashley for the provocative conversations that they've started in their exhibitions. And we are going to both build on those conversations and start a few of our own. And on that note, we can't resist, I know I certainly can't resist, starting again with Olympia, since she's making her appearance on our shores as a painting for the very first time. So it's thrilling to have her here.
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad. Shall I say a few words, Kathy?
Yes, please.
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here with you. I'm sorry not to be able to see all of you from this ethereal, virtual, digital medium, but I'm glad I can at least focus on Kathy and see the slides. And thank you again. Yes, I would like to echo Kathy for these two marvelous and very thought-provocative, very rich presentation, each one of them, Dita and then Stephan and Ashley. Those two paintings, I'm glad, Kathy, you brought them up, because I've been myself very curious. I mean, Stephan or Ashley, I think, said something about the fact that there's, especially the Degas, so intriguing and puzzling and almost impossible to make sense of. But what I find fascinating, of course, they are absolutely rigorously contemporaneous to each other. The Manet, needless to say, changes history. The Degas, I don't think anybody in the audience should be blamed for not having seen it, not having known about it, or even failing a test if one were to ask who did it, because it is definitely not what one knows of as Degas. But what they do have in common, and I'm assuming this is what you were trying to tease out by this juxtaposition, is the fact that both of these works retain a staunch attachment to history in some ways. And we should remember that until basically the mid-19th century, the last half of the 19th century, there was no chance for any given artist, professional artist, to make a living, to make a career, were it not through the channel of history painting. So what I do find interesting in this juxtaposition, I'm curious, Kathy, to how you read this, is that one, Degas appears to be, even though this painting again is so complex and weird, but he appears to be sort of staunchly immersing himself in pure history painting. We don't quite figure out what the scene is about. Whereas Manet does the opposite. He looks at history painting from Velasquez, the Renaissance, and turns it upside down. He is absolutely, consciously, and I would say powerfully, masterfully taking control over history. Whereas to me, in this painting to the right, Degas is still under the weight of the all-prestigious history painting, which crowns the Academy, as it were, at that time.
I think you're absolutely right, Joachim. And just a reminder, Degas and Manet were only 2 years apart, but it was really Manet who burst onto the scene and made his name as an artist first with the Salon des Refusés, Luncheon on the Grass in 1863, and then with Olympia in 1865. And as you said, Joachim, Manet was taking on tradition, but he was immediately turning it on his head and modernizing it, because he was looking back at the tradition of the idealized mythological nude in the form of Venus, but yet Manet is presenting not a goddess, a mythological goddess Venus. He's giving us Olympia, a contemporary Parisian prostitute, with which everyone who would have seen that work at the Salon in 1865 would have known. And right. to your point, Joachim, about Degas over there, still rooted in the past, still thinking about medieval history and other sort of weird episodic moments from history that are, I think, obscure to us today and were probably obscure to viewers and not understood even in the 19th century. These two works are hanging now in the same gallery in the exhibition, but it's, Manet who totally sucks the air out of the room, and it's the only thing, that you see, and that was deliberate on Manet's part. And Degas was, at this moment in 1865, still trying to find himself. But yet, I think, to my eyes, it was Manet's Olympia and what Manet was doing with history painting, but reorienting history to the present, that suddenly kind of shook Degas out of maybe a little bit of a stupor or a little bit of a block and galvanized Degas to join the present, which he soon did, especially in the form of portraiture. So this next pairing, Joachim, I don't know if you had some thoughts on the Bellelli's and Manet's balcony, just two magisterial portraits in the exhibition.
It's a magnificent juxtaposition. I love the fact that you brought these two images. As those of you who've had the privilege of seeing the show in Paris, these two were juxtaposed with each other, and I think they are now here. Definitely, we could say that Degas and Manet finally are on the same ground. And so again, I'm very curious, Kathy, to hear your thoughts on this. But I find that in a similar way, I want to use those two words, those two tropes, as far as Manet and Degas are concerned, in terms of the establishment, in terms of the historical and actual context within which they live. Stephan put the emphasis several times on the fact that both of them, come from very respectable, well-to-do bourgeois backgrounds. They come from the higher society, the higher bourgeois society of the 19th century, and both of them, I think, in different terms, were wrestling certainly in the early part of their lives, with the notion, with the need of being acknowledged by their peers. Both families had turned their backs on their decisions to become artists, and it was only through the agency of recapturing the seriousness of the job of the profession of being an artist that they could hope to get that vital acknowledgement. But what I find fascinating is that neither of them succeeds in a way, or rather, I would say that they both deliberately take a sort of tangential direction. So here we're in a typical kind of traditional format of family portrait, yet those portraits are, again, so incomprehensible. Look at the Bellili family, no one except the little girl to the left is actually facing the audience. There's a kind of absolute discordancy, or I would almost say schizophrenic relationship within that family group. And within the Manet, it's even more incomprehensible. Why this balcony? Where are we? Who are we, the audience, facing this group of three people, again, whose gazes never form any kind of meaningful triangle. So you're always left, certainly with these two paintings, with a huge question mark at the end. What is going on? And who are we towards this painting?
Well, to the point of what is going on with the case of the Bellelli family, we do know a little bit about that thanks to who the sitters are. As Stephan said, it was Degas' aunt and her family, and he knew at the time he was painting this portrait that she was in a very, very unhappy relationship with her husband, and I think that's quite clear in the way that Degas has structured the composition. Right? Even the little dog on the lower right corner is partially cropped because, the dog is this traditional symbol of fidelity in portraiture, but yet he can't wait to get the heck out of there because there's so much tension in this scene, and it really is, but it is Degas taking this tradition of the family portrait that goes back to the 17th century, and he's painting it on a large scale, the kind of scale for a traditional history painting, and he's subverting it, just as Manet was subverting tradition in Olympia, because he's painting essentially a dysfunctional family portrait. I mean, who wants a portrait painted to commemorate a family where nobody is happy? I mean, it's just so, it's so wonderfully, it's just so bizarre and so powerful, but so psychologically compelling. And that, for me, is where Degas, throughout the exhibition, you really see Degas getting into the kind of psyches of his sitters and bringing some of those tensions and relationships and feelings and animosities out on canvas, whether it's in a portrait or in the interior scene that Ashley and Stephan just showed us as well. I mean, that's fraught with a very different kind of tension, but nonetheless, the tension is already here in the Bellelli family, which was shown in the Salon in 1867, but relatively unremarked on, and then Degas kept it in his studio until his death, and as Stephan said, it was then quite a revelation. And for me, I think Degas' example galvanized Manet in the realm of portraiture too. And so Manet was started to think, well, how can I make a portrait look modern, just as as he was transforming the rest of painting? And for me, that group being on the balcony speaks to some of that sense of urban alienation and, sort of alone in a crowd feeling, or the observer in a crowd not relating to one another, that we saw in the café concert scenes. But at the same time, it's so modern when one thinks that this is the decade when Haussmann was transforming the boulevards of Paris. And we could just picture this family on one of those wonderful wrought iron Parisian balconies, or this group rather, and looking down at the life of modern Paris kind of unfolding beneath their feet. But, in proper French fashion, not showing too much interest, at least on the outside.
Yeah. I think I totally agree with you, Kathy. I think we're coming more or less towards the same goal through maybe slightly different ways. I love the fact that you're bringing back 17th century tradition of family portraits. In the 17th century, let's imagine a fictional exercise that Degas had been a 17th century artist with the same talent. He would have used filters. He would have edited out all this discrepancy, all this dysfunctionality. The term you used, it's absolutely spot on. What he does that is absolutely revolutionary here, and let's not forget we're only 20 years away from the birth of psychoanalysis, and so that what he's doing is to let in all the stuff that is usually absolutely repellent and systematically edited out. And that's what I think makes some of the forceful modernity of certainly the Degas, but I think equally the Manet as well.
So shall we move on then to the kind of final coda where, as Stephan aptly titles it in his essay in the catalog, Degas after Manet, because Manet died in 1883, and he was only 51 years old, and Degas would outlive him considerably until I believe he died in 1916, but yet their relationship would continue even after Manet died. And in fact, at Manet's death, Degas was said to have commented, "He was greater than we thought," which is perhaps something of a backhanded compliment, maybe. But I think if you want to talk a little bit more about Degas after Manet, Joachim.
Well, we started with your great juxtaposition with those two historical paintings, Olympia one and the Scenes of the War second. And I believe that history, in a way, history with a big H, is absolutely constantly one of the dynamic one of the dynamic factors throughout the lives of all the Impressionists, whoever they are. Manet, because he is, as you pointed out, right from 1863, the first, in a way, to gain public knowledge, even though he's has very mixed feelings himself about that public reputation. He doesn't want to be with the Impressionists, we know that. But he brings history on the forefront. He turns, by his presence in the Salon des Refusés, brings in history with him. And he's the first one to die, 1883, well, basically beforehand. And as soon as he dies, all of them, not just Degas, but Monet, Morisot, Pissarro, will be gathering together and trying to bring in Manet to the Louvre. And by the 1890s, so there was in 1895, Stephan mentioned it. I mean, Degas is a stupendous collector of works by Manet. It's interesting, as Stephan mentioned, he owned the entire oeuvre of Manet's graphic production, practically. And this particular painting was one of the efforts that Degas did put together. By the early mid-90s, he was intending to create a museum, a Degas museum. Berthe Morisot, just a few days before she dies, tells her daughter, if Degas continues to go on with his museum project, tell him to come here and pick up any Manet he wants. So Manet is the kind of magnet of history revisited, again, twisted and transformed entirely through the presence of Manet. So somebody said before that Degas was actually, what that museum would have been an anti-Luxembourg. Basically, up to the mid-19th century, what was dominating was the Italian Renaissance, the classical vision of, up to the neoclassicism. What those guys were doing is to absolutely transform this. And they decided, we need this to be recognized by history. And I think Degas is the first one to have the agency, the cogency, to the vision to say, let's do it. Eventually, unfortunately, he didn't give shape to that Degas museum, but it would have been fantastic, and this would have been there.
Well, and to bring it back full circle, not only as did he do this in other works by Manet, Degas bought Paul Gauguin's 1895 copy, or 1891 copy after Manet's Olympia. So it goes back to the sort of encounter, the two artists in the public forum of the Salon in 1865. It's almost as if Degas might well be acknowledging the impact that Olympia had on his own growth as an artist as well. So
absolutely.
Food for thought. But now to go on to another pairing, as it were. And it's a pairing that you know well, Joachim, having curated the magisterial Cézanne Pissarro show at MoMA in the early 2000s. Here we see Pissarro and Cézanne side by side, and you have, they too came together in the early 1860s, just like Manet and Degas. Joachim, what do you think brought, and their relationship lasted for well into the 1880s, their last documented encounter, 1882. What do you think brought the two of them together in the first place?
So, I was thank you, Kathy, first of all, for your kind words, but I was mentioning before the description of what Degas' effort, or Degas' point would have been had this Degas Museum taken place, an anti-Luxembourg. The Luxembourg stood for whatever was traditional, official, salon type of art, something that none of these people, Manet, Degas, Cézanne, Pissarro, Gauguin, and on, none of them had any patience for that system. But what's interesting is that they took many different strategies in order to oppose, to stand up, to resist against the overwhelming dominance of the system up to, let's say, the very last decade of the 19th century. And those two guys, they don't have time for history painting. Cézanne, maybe a little bit, but Cézanne takes history painting and completely caricatures it. It's almost grotesque, ridiculous. His very, very early paintings. Pissarro, you never see a single history painting. I don't know a single example. So they don't go the Manet-Degas road at all. What they do is to immerse themselves in nature, and eventually Cézanne has this wonderful expression that sums it all up. He said, I wanted to find the Louvre in nature. And that's pretty much what they would do. You see them sort of ready to go to work. These guys apparently would do an average of 16 to 20 miles walking, trying to track the proper motif and so on. And you know, there's not light material behind the back. You see Pissarro's with his rucksacks, Cézanne, same thing. I mean, these things, you know, were made out of wood, weighed probably, and you know, tens of pounds, if not more.
So it was also a workout. That's what you're saying, Joachim.
It was definitely a workout. Absolutely.
Why don't we jump into one of the pairings that you selected? Because I made the mistake of saying to Joachim in a preliminary conversation, oh yeah, Pissarro was Cézanne's teacher. And Joachim was like, no, it's far more complicated than that. And so I stood and stand corrected. But before I turn it over to you, Joachim, I just want to share what Cézanne had said of his relationship with Pissarro. Quote, as for old Pissarro, and by the way, Pissarro was only 9 years older than Cézanne. That's me editorializing. As for old Pissarro, he was a father to me. He was a man you could turn to for advice. He was something like God. So now I turn that over to you, Joachim, for your thoughts.
So anyway, Kathy, I did not say that you were wrong. Absolutely not. There is definitely
you did, and it's okay.
I did. Okay.
You did, and it's fine.
But okay, what I meant to say is that their relationship is slightly more complex. I mean, first of all, they meet in a school environment in the early 1860s when they're both students. And they're both students. Now here, I'm maybe contradicting myself a bit. They're trying to do what Degas and Manet were trying to do. What is given to any given artist in the 1860s. You have no choice. There's no option. You either study, academic training, nude, history painting, etc., or you do nothing. So there's no trace of them having done history painting, but they did. We know that from the same models, actually. Some incredible early, very beautiful early academic drawings. But so they meet as peers, as equals in a sense. They're both in the school. Both of them find out that they both have the same repulsion for the system as indeed Degas and Manet had in different ways. But both of them Cézanne writes a letter to another friend of theirs, and for a while, all of them have the illusion that despite the Salon des Refusés, they may have a chance. And so Degas had it, Pissarro had a small chance to get into the Salon. When they do get in, nobody notices them. Cézanne absolutely never had such luck. But Cézanne continues to heroically, naively, you could say, hope. And he writes to the Minister of Culture, if you can imagine that, under the Second Empire, under Napoleon III. And he says, I've written to you before. I've asked why my painting has not been shown to the public. I demand that the public sees my paintings. Of course, he receives absolutely no answer, and eventually gives an explanation of this to some of his friends. He said, look, it's enough already. They've decided to slam the door at my face. I'm slamming the door at their faces. And this is a turning point whereby both of them, Cézanne, Pissarro for sure, decide, forget about Paris, forget about the Salon. There's no chance. We are not interested. And they continue on their trajectory looking at the landscape, at nature, and that will lead straight to what Dita was talking about. There's a very interesting thread that will take you to the Fauve only 30 years later, and that's so. Cézanne has a very complicated relationship with his parents. His father no longer speaks to him. He has a baby with his girlfriend. The parents barely know about this. And when he talks, beautiful quote that you mentioned, has to do with the fact that basically Cézanne is in Paris, very, very far away from the south of Provence. And he writes to his mother, but has almost no family other than the Pissarros. And the Pissarros totally adopt him. He moves from Paris to Pontoise, where the Pissarros live, so that they can do what the photographs you showed earlier on projected, which is go out and work out on the landscape. And he sees that painting by Pissarro to the left is fairly large. The painting by Cézanne in contrast is about 3/4 the size. But what happened is that when he moves to Pontoise, he sees that painting. He was not next to Pissarro he knew Pissarro, but they didn't work together at that particular point in 71. He borrows the painting by Pissarro and returns 2 weeks later with the painting that you have to your right. And what I find fascinating to me, and that's why I'm emphasizing maybe their collaboration or their conversations, complicated conversations, rather than pupil-teacher relationship, is that I find already in 71, 72, the Cézanne painting is so different from the Pissarros if you look at the details.
Yeah, you can certainly see the difference. Even though it's purported to be a copy, you can already see Cézanne inserting Cézanne and his Cézanne-ness, if you will, into the painting.
Absolutely.
On the right, especially in the handling of the trees on the left, which are much more summarily painted, whereas Pissarro does his trees in much greater detail. But nonetheless, this seminal borrowing, where Cézanne would copy, so to speak, Pissarro, soon they were out there painting together side by side. And as you noted, Cézanne moves to Pontoise. And as Pissarro recalled of this decade, the 1870s, "We were always together," Pissarro said. And he added, "Cézanne came under my influence and I his." So now you've given us a selection of some of these pairings. Oh, sorry, here are just a couple of details that show their different handling. But
well, as you started pointing out, the house, if you look back very quickly at the previous one, it's exactly what you were saying. The previous one, the houses.
I'm trying.
It's even though it's you look at the Cézanne, it's much more summarily done. And we're 35 years away from the beginning of Cubism, and in 72 there's no such thought about this, but Cézanne is kind of almost ready with a message to be passed on to the 20th century. Whereas Pissarro, look at the smoke coming out of the chimney from the detail of the Pissarro. It's much more impressionistic, obviously, for the lack of better word. So Cézanne is already, even though they're starting to work together, way, I don't want to say ahead, but he's already formulating a different language.
And let's jump to another pairing as the dialogue continues. We're in the mid-1870s now. What about this pair, Joachim?
So at that particular point, they both look at Courbet, interestingly enough, as a common source of interest. Very different paintings, very different motifs as well. But I think, and the Cézanne is maybe a bit later than the Pissarro. However, I find the commonalities, the language they are mastering together. One of the peculiar technical lessons that they take from Courbet is that Courbet juggled with both palette knives and brushwork. And you find in both of these paintings, as if one could look at them physically, it's really extremely striking. But I love just a small detail that always fascinates me, and I have no idea what that is. If you look at the Cézanne, and you look right almost straight underneath the little footbridge, there's this floating brushstroke of white paint on the water, almost like a big feather. I no idea what that is about, but it is so fascinating. And without that particular detail, I feel the painting would not have the same resonance.
And their shared admiration for the great realist painter Gustave Courbet would come out in a portrait of Cézanne that Pissarro paints that I know is further along here. I'm not sure where in our lineup, but we'll see that come out again in a portrait. I will jump to another collaboration where the two of them are actually painting the same site at the same time. And so this really gives a chance to really explore the very different visions and techniques of the two artists. They talk about painting their sensations in front of nature. And Joachim, if you could talk about how Pissarro's sensations differ from those of Cézanne in this pairing.
Yes. You used an absolutely crucial term, which anchors both of their sensibility, sensation. Sensation is what you retain in yourself. Each self has their own sensation. And Pissarro says, yes, we all, and in fact, I think the term may have come from Cézanne, but they both adopt it completely. But Pissarro later on reflects on that particular moment, and he says, yes, we had our common sensations, but what was most important is that each retained his own. And there's no better illustration than those two paintings, which are, one a very fluffy, beautiful. You can almost smell the blossoms in those pear trees, apple trees. I mean, the spring takes over, and you barely see the architecture. Cézanne has nothing to do with this. He sort of deletes the trees lose their blossoms and let appear again the architecture, which you described earlier on as summarily put together. It's very, very true. Look at the roofs and the top building, how incredibly different they are in each painting.
I think because this 1870s were such a fruitful decade, we have more ground to cover, and we might have to go a little more quickly, Joachim. But this is another pair, again, similar compositions that the two painted at that time.
Right, but we can keep going. But in the Cézanne, you have that's all we have. Let's keep going because we have much to cover. So that's another aspect. Which Stephan pointed out, the relationship between Degas as a collector of Manet. Here, both of them were collectors of each other's works abundantly. And that little painting, which used to be in the Mellon collection to the left, actually belonged to Cézanne. He depicted him, so he painted himself in a studio with a still life, and you see the painting by Pissarro here. This is a portrait of Cézanne in his studio with the painting by himself. So, it gets so interestingly rich and complex. And of course, you were pointing out earlier the caricature that is on the right-hand side above Cézanne's left shoulder is a caricature of Courbet, who amusingly is seen sipping his beer. He was always drinking beer and seems to be almost about to spill his beer bock on Cézanne's shoulder. So he is the almost a guru, I mean, a very important influence and also a political influence. We might want to get into this later. I don't know if we have time, but basically Courbet, through his proximity with Proudhon, the foremost anarchist philosopher in France, was one of the biggest voices in anarchism, a voice of radical politics in the 19th century. Courbet went to prison, had to be eventually exiled in Switzerland after the Commune, which was perhaps one of the foremost anarchist revolution in Paris in 1870. And that had a lot to do with thinking of Cézanne and Pissarro.
Perhaps he's not necessarily pouring the beer on Cézanne. Maybe it's a toast. Maybe he's raising a glass in a toast. We could think of it that way.
I like that.
But I think in this instance now, this gets to a moment where Cézanne, it's 1881, near the end of really his close collaboration with Pissarro. But he seems to be looking back on this early work by Pissarro that, as you've pointed out, was a very seminal work for Cézanne's development. If you want to talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, it gets. This is the time when things get sour, as you pointed out. Well, I think we believe they lost each other in 1885, but yes, the last documented one, you're right, is around the time of that painting by Cézanne. And what happens is this double-edged sort, whereby Cézanne says something like, had Pissarro continued to paint as he was painting basically in 1870 or 71, or just before, he would have been the first among us. So if you read this correctly, you understand, and I don't know how Pissarro took this, but basically after 1870, 71, the slide is going down, and you're no longer the first, my friend. But what Cézanne does is, interestingly enough, I mean, over and over, we could show 10 slides, is that he goes back to that particular period of Pissarro pre-Impressionism, which he seems to adore, and I share Cézanne's admiration here. I mean, this is the painting at the Guggenheim Museum. It's an extraordinary painting, and Cézanne seems to be now working with the Pissarro of 15 years before. It's a kind of very strange situation. Again, I don't know how Pissarro took that. It's a sort of half strange compliment.
It had to be a bit of a blow to the ego, one would think. Yes. I mean, only normally. But I think also thinking about, though, turning the tables, how did Cézanne influence Pissarro?
Right. That's what's happened. That I don't know. You cannot credit that to Pissarro, and it seems impossible to me. But by the 80s, and definitely it gets stronger and stronger, Cézanne develops this hatched way of formulating, of applying his brushwork. Ted Reff called it the constructive brush stroke. It's a very useful term. And what you see with this sort of staccato of parallel, oblique brush strokes, again, will intensify through the years. Bizarrely, by the mid-1880s, and that's not so well known, Pissarro starts doing the same thing. So here, as you said, the tables are just being turned. And, so my take on this, and I don't know, this is my personal read, you may disagree, but I actually, I think I said it in the MoMA catalog, that I believe that actually Cézanne made Pissarro ready through that lesson. He made him ready to meet Seurat, which will happen more or less at the same time.
And I just pulled up the Seurat and Pissarro comparison to make that point. Because as you know, Pissarro did dabble with, if you will, Neo-Impressionism in the 1880s. And you can see the beginnings of that in the work on the left and with our gorgeous little Seurat on the right. I think we need to jump a little bit ahead, so that, talking about sort of the coda of Cézanne Pissarro, because once again, Cézanne did outlive Pissarro just by a couple of years, and it's worth noting, though, that the Cézanne on the left, for example, was painted around the time of the Salon d'Automne, where Matisse and Derain burst onto the scene with the Fauves. And then there's this late Pissarro from 1897, where Pissarro was painting urban imagery again, no longer on plein air, but from windows of hotel rooms, in this case in Paris. So if you have a sort of final coda as to what you would say about kind of the end of Cézanne Pissarro at the end of their careers and their lives, really.
Yes, after, as you pointed out earlier, after the mid-1880s, they have practically no contact. We know that during in 1895, Vollard, the famous art dealer, puts together the first major Cézanne solo commercial show in his gallery. So at that point, Pissarro hasn't seen Cézanne for 10, 12 years, and goes to the Vollard show, and he's absolutely flabbergasted. He's absolutely astonished to rediscover his friend and see what he has been up to. I don't know whether the reciprocal is true. I don't know if Cézanne ever saw what Pissarro was up to, but they went on completely divergent paths, and Cézanne returns to the south, and Pissarro never goes to the south, despite Cézanne's early invitations. And so they do their own things. But I'm personally, again, I'm almost certain that they never lost track of the common impact of their first 20 years together was such that it was almost like a capital on which they continued to evolve in completely different ways. And but I find there's a quote that you and I were discussing prior to as we were preparing this conversation, and there's a quote where Cézanne says something extraordinary to somebody called Joachim Pissarro. He said, Pissarro, this is after Pissarro died, Pissarro had the fluke of being born in the West Indies, indeed. Why was he lucky to be born in the West Indies? because there, says Cézanne, he learnt drawing without a master. And we go back to this idea that, the idea of shedding any form of training, of established academic formation, that you have to return to yourself, to your own sensation, to your own pure sensation. And I think that's one of the things that the two of them, it's not one and the other. It's never a active-passive relationship. It's a co-active relationship where they both were the catalysts that enabled each of them to become themselves.
Well, in many ways, their sort of ultimate subversiveness really sets the stage for the final pairing that we will briefly consider in the remaining 5 minutes or so that we have. And Dita's exhibition sets the stage for that with that 9 weeks in Collioure where Matisse and Derain came together, and it was followed later that year with the Salon d'Automne where the Fauves, as they became known, burst onto the scene with these two works, both of which were in that exhibition. But and Derain, as Dita said, was largely overshadowed by Cézanne, and by Matisse. And it was this Matisse, woman with a hat, that really got most of the attention, and it was purchased by the American collector Leo Stein, brother of Gertrude Stein, and it quickly found pride of place in their apartment where Matisse was welcomed at salons there as the king of the Fauves. And meanwhile, at the same time, a young Picasso, newly arrived from Spain, was trying to make a name for himself in Paris. And every time that the Steins brought him over to dinner or to an evening, what did he have to look at on the walls of their apartment but this Matisse? So you can imagine that sort of hung over him and loomed quite large. And Joachim and I have thought of this pairing as a way to really talk about how that might have played out, that rivalry in pictorial terms, if you will.
Yes, that becomes another, the meeting of titans, but titans who are in the making. And it's really interesting the way you absolutely, I completely agree with the way you couch things. There's no question that until 1907, Matisse is, he's much older, he's much more established, he's really the center of the new budding avant-garde, and Picasso is a young guy who just arrived, extraordinarily gifted, already picked up by Vollard, by the way, who also represented Cézanne and Pissarro, interestingly enough. But it's not until 1907, as you and I discussed, that this revolutionary, bombastic, earth-shaking creation of the Demoiselle d'Avignon comes out of Picasso's hand. And that thing that's almost unnameable because it's not a cubist work, it's not, it's sort of, it belongs to its own sphere, and it's an apex. And I think that at that particular point, it's not just for Matisse, but it's for everybody who was living, painting, and thinking about their position in history. They had to somehow grapple with that incomprehensible monster that Picasso had just produced.
Joachim, we'll get to the Demoiselle in just a second, but I just want to give this brief kind of due to Picasso's Gertrude Stein, because it was Gertrude Stein who perhaps might have invented the notion of frenemy and didn't even know it when she wrote of the two artists at this time, they were friends but enemies. So I think, it's again where their influence plays off, and you can see Picasso, he was almost trying to do the exact opposite of everything that Matisse did, going monochromatic, where Matisse was all color. But then, of course, Picasso had that famous discovery that would inform the Demoiselle d'Avignon of African art. And also of Iberian art and Spanish Romanesque art, that all came into play in his portrayal of Gertrude Stein, but then soon thereafter in the Demoiselle d'Avignon, which we can turn to next. And in this particular pairing, we see the Demoiselle from 1907, and Matisse. Now the balance of power really shifts, right, at this moment in their relationship, because it's Picasso now with the Demoiselle, which Matisse, by the way, disliked along with just about every other artist and critic in Paris when it first came out. And Matisse said something strangely diplomatic like, well, when a friend does something, a little boldness discovered in a friend's work is shared by all. Well, what does that mean, right?
Yes, it's trying to belittle this monster. Yes, I believe that it was impossible for anyone to make anything, even to this day. I mean, the Demoiselle d'Avignon remains what it is because it surpasses anything we can say about it, anything we can see about it. But I absolutely agree with you. I think that from that particular point, the situation shifts, and there's going to be. I did actually curated a show with Yves Bois at the Kimball on the gentle rivalry between Matisse and Picasso. That was 97, 98, I think. And Yves Bois borrowed Damish's expression of a series of chess moves. And it's really like the two of them continuously play games of chess, and one wins a game, the other one loses, etc. It comes up and down. It's a very uneven relationship, but it's one where they are absolutely passionately locked within that frenemy relationship that you described through Gertrude Stein. And one of the extraordinary things is that Matisse, being older, dies 20 years before Picasso in 54. And you look at Picasso's paintings in 1954 and 55, he's in deep, deep mourning. I mean, suddenly you see black, which is by all means the color of Matisse, as Dita pointed out earlier on. And he lost his one of his raison d'etre, pictorially speaking. Whom was he going to play chess with?
Perhaps let's give, I love that, the chess thing. Let's give Matisse the final word, and it's this quote from Matisse that he was quoted as saying this not long after the Demoiselle d'Avignon appeared on the scene in 1907. Matisse on artistic influences by way of summation, and perhaps your final thoughts on that, Joachim. But Matisse said in 1907, "For my part, I have never avoided the influence of others. I would have considered it cowardice and lack of sincerity toward myself. I have accepted influences, but I think I have always known how to dominate them."
It's beautiful.
So what do you, I mean, is that a little bit, methinks the gentleman doth protest too much in 1907? Or really, I mean, of course it would play out much longer, but what do you think of that quote from Matisse as a closure?
I think you couldn't have chosen a better quote. I think that sums up, and by the way, we didn't rehearse this particular one. I want to turn to you, Kathy, and say this is brilliant. Last night, I didn't even know you would pull out that quote. It's fantastic. And if I may say so, it sums up. I mean, let's go back to our first two slides, the Manet and the Degas. What are these guys trying to do there? They are trying to sum up their strength, their energies, their selves, in order to deal with the then overwhelming influences of the system, of the establishment, of history painting, etc., pressure, peer pressure, parent pressure, and so on. So it's not just artistic influences in those days. It's a sort of social system. And I think what we've seen through those different examples, I mean, I would say each of these examples we looked at today somehow deals with a conundrum that you just mentioned through this quote by Matisse. Can you reread it again? It's beautiful.
Just the part about influences. I have accepted influences, but I think I have always known how to dominate them.
Yeah, it's perfect. And that's the kind of the paradox, the irony of it all. It's that they cannot avoid these influences, but how do they get on top of it? And when you look at Picasso and Matisse together, it's a constant wrestling game. Who will get on top of it? There are moments where Picasso is virtually insulting in the 1920s. He calls a painting by Matisse a comfortable armchair. You look at it and you sit and you fall asleep, and then yes, not exactly kind. But then the next move is that Matisse shows up from behind the woodwork, a group of sculptures he never showed before, done 20 years before at a gallery called Pierre Loeb. Picasso has no idea that Matisse could be such a gigantic sculptor. And he stops painting, which for Picasso is like unheard of. And he buys himself a sculpture studio in Bois-Gelou and starts becoming a sculptor. So it's sort of, the wheel is endless.
That could be continued in another conversation. So Joachim, I just want to thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to my colleagues. Go see Manet, Degas. Go see Manet, Degas, go see Vertigo of Color, and then since it's almost 5 o'clock, perhaps think about another pairing that you might want to have this evening that might be wine with dinner or something. So thank you, and thank you, Joachim.
Thank you, Kathy. It's been a great joy, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone who's Joshua, Isaac, your wonderful team put together this program beautifully. Thank you all.